Thank you to everybody for joining us. This is our 6th program in the spring. And we have one more program that's going to be coming up on Monday at 10 o'clock in 2 weeks. So that's May 6th. It's been wonderful having these programs, and we invite you for our last one before we start up again in the fall. I am June Blanc, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Peter Russell, Tyler Beebe, and Naomi Marrow. All our programs are recorded, so if you missed something, you want to hear it back, or you heard something great and you want to tell people, which we hope you will, to go to the Chappaqua website, look under events, and you'll see the foreign policy recordings, and they're great. Many people enjoyed them. We get them from actually all over the world, people tuning in. So check it out. At our last meeting, we had Dr. Alexander Arafianto, who was a senior fellow at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, who spoke on Indonesia. Today, we're going to look again to the other side of the globe, and this time to India, the world's most populous country, largest democracy. They are voting now. And we'll be looking at whether they are on the path to become an economic powerhouse. Following our usual format, our host, this time Naomi Marrow, will introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Deepa Ollapally, who is the research professor at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs and specializes in Indian foreign policy, Indo-China relations, and the Asian regional maritime security. She will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then we will begin a Q&A. Members of our group will ask questions, and then we'll open it up to the chat. But please put your chat questions in. We really enjoy being able to discuss things that are of interest to all of you. We'll end the program at 11:15. And now let me turn the program over to Naomi Marrow.
Thank you, June. I am honored to introduce you all to Deepa Ollapally. Her background is outstanding. She has covered so many bases informing the world about India, India-China relations, Asian regional and maritime security, and on it goes. She's written 5 books, one currently a funded book, and most people don't get that, a big power competition for influence in the Indian Ocean region. As you mentioned, she has taught or worked at several universities, got her PhD at Columbia, a good place not to be today. She has received grants from the major, highly esteemed organizations, Carnegie, MacArthur, Smith Richardson. Oh, we can talk personally about Smith Richardson at another time, Deepa. The Rockefeller Foundation, it goes on and on and on. She is also a media personality, having made appearances on CNN, BBC, CBS, Reuters, and today on a slightly smaller media outlet, but one in which people intentionally sign on and want to hear her. So, Deepa, welcome and go to it.
Naomi and June and the rest of you, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I have, of course, heard of Chappaqua, but I didn't realize you had such a active group of people interested in foreign policy, so it's my pleasure to be here. As I speak today, India is in the middle of the world's largest democratic elections. Now, there are many questions about whether or not there has been backsliding on democracy in India, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, perhaps during Q&A. But today, what I want to do is to look at what is happening in India in terms of its rise to power, because as we know, India is, one of the now among the largest and fastest growing economies in the world. It just overtook its former colonial power, Britain, as it just superseded Britain last year in terms of the economic might. So clearly it is, in some sense, India's time. And today I wanted to talk about something that, and I'm going to share a screen. I don't usually do a lot of PowerPoints, but I thought it might be interesting since we are on Zoom, and sometimes it keeps everybody a little more alert. So let me just share my screen. Is that okay?
Yes, it is.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So I just titled it The Great Indian Foreign Policy Identity Crisis and What's at Stake. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, as I said, India is on a rise. India had been kind of a potential power for decades. Since its independence in 1947, it has really had a kind of a tough time emerging as a true global power. And as it's making that transition from a kind of a reluctant, ambiguous power, unlike, say, China or Russia or the US or others, India has been kind of holding back in many ways. And so right now, when I say an identity crisis, two things. One, there's a kind of a domestically, what kind of power it's going to be, but internationally, where does India stand? Where does it fit? And believe it or not, until recently in the US, and I'm going to talk more from from what we look at, because that's where we're sitting, India was never really part of the US's larger Asian worldview, because we looked at it as Asia Pacific. And the Asia Pacific, and I'm giving you a map here because it's always sometimes good to see the map. The Asia Pacific stopped at the Pacific Ocean. It did not include the Indian Ocean because it was, traditionally the US's, the world wars have always been in the Pacific or in the Atlantic, not in the Indian Ocean. And so the notion of Asia Pacific in recent years for the US had been China-centric, and therefore that's where the attention was. But since the mid-2000s or so, when India started rising and its growth, at the same time that China had been just fast-tracking and just sort of, going at supersonic speeds to its rise, US got much more worried about China's rise and needed to look for partners. Not only that, as a maritime country in the Asia, the US needed maritime partners. And India, when you look at the map, you can see the importance of India. India is what you might call an unsinkable aircraft carrier, because the way it juts out, it occupies the central space between the oil-rich, energy-rich Middle East and the fast-growing economies of East Asia and Asia. It's right in the middle. And as, and so the US and particularly the US and Hillary Clinton, your neighbor in Chappaqua, is one of the first to come up with another another term here called the Indo-Pacific. And here the idea is looking at Asia Pacific versus Indo-Pacific. So in Asia Pacific, China is the center. Indo-Pacific, India becomes much more central. And so right now, the reason I'm saying that, there is a tension in the identity, the international identity of India, is that for India, there's a question as to how much of it should be kind of China, countering China as part of an Indo-Pacific strategy. And every country now, every major country has an Indo-Pacific strategy, because the Atlantic, until the Ukraine war at least, for the last 15 years or so, has been taking a back seat because of the rise of China. And all eyes have shifted to the Pacific. And then, of course, connected to it is the Indian Ocean because of its location. So as we are looking at this sort of new constellation, new world views that are emerging, I want to just step back for a minute and say something about how India domestically is placed to debate this question. So its foreign policy identity is somewhat connected to its domestic identity and how it sees itself. So let me just take you back to some of you here may, of this generation, of my generation, we will remember people like Nehru, India's first prime minister, and his daughter Indira Gandhi, and currently, of course, the one who's running as part of the opposition is Nehru's great-grandson, Rahul Gandhi. But back to Nehru. India, in his view, and as it came out of colonialism, it was a country that was obviously weak, but very aware of its own civilizational identity, its history, its greatness in the past. And one thing it did not want to do was to get sucked into a competition between the nuclear rivals, USSR and US, and get caught up in that in the global struggle against communism. So Nehru took a non-aligned movement, meaning we're not aligning with anybody. We're on our own. The global non-aligned movement, which some of you may know, but many of the post-colonial countries joined them. So India was a leader in that. It was not, it was more of a defensive country. It didn't build up its military very much. It didn't spend much money on that. It was development oriented. So Nehru was very much, little influenced by the Gandhian nonviolent movement and so on. And this was not just in 1947. It continued for decades because Nehru's party, the Congress Party, was in power for decades. They were very popular. They got reelected. And so for decades, they were in power. And it became part of the DNA of India, that it was going to be this sort of much more of a diplomacy-oriented, defensive kind of power. 2014 comes along. Of course, lots of things happen in between then and 2014, but let me just skip to the current day Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, from the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a much more Hindu nationalist party. Oh, I should say also in Nehru's India, it's a secular government, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, equal status. And I can say more about that. But Muslims, there are almost 220 million Muslims. So it's 14% of India's population. Just think about it here. It's like 14%, I think, are African Americans in this country. It's that important. All right, so along comes Modi's India. And one of the ways in which he talks about foreign policy is that India has been holding itself back. And that for India to play a bigger role, you need to be bolder, take more, stronger decisions, arm yourself, shed yourself of this kind of moralistic non-alignment. So it's a very different kind of outlook that he's come in with. And one of the results has been that he's moving much more into the US camp, not just the US, but also the other Asian democratic countries. And all of it is, they're not going to say it publicly, but let's face it, it is because of the rise of China. And so you have kind of a tension both domestically because of a secular vision versus a more Hindu nationalist vision for India. But the idea for Modi is that if you don't have a strong sense of yourself as this great civilizational power, that you're not going to be able to play a bigger role on the international scene. So, and by the way, he is going to come back in the elections that are going to be only announced in June because it's taking 6 weeks to reach all the 968 million people who are registered. But what we don't know is whether he's going to come back a little bit with less of a majority in parliament or not. That's really the only question. Okay, but so I already spoke a little bit about this, but this is in the U.S. In my field, if you go to the State Department, if you go to the Defense, White House, and even academics here, we're all using the term Indo-Pacific when we refer to that part of the region, the area that I showed you in the map. Asia Pacific is only used by China right now. And so the narrative is interesting to follow. So the India's, what I would call the post-colonial identity, is kind of being reconstructed. And the reason this whole Indo-Pacific approach is so important is that for all practical purposes, this Indo-Pacific approach is India's China strategy. Because again, and I'll say a little bit more about the strategy toward China, which is testing the Indian approach of the former period when was much more global South. India is a developing country. We're not a superpower. We don't have the economic wherewithal or the military wherewithal. We don't want to get sucked into these conflicts. But today, it's a different calculation. And so that's where the what I call the identity crisis comes into play. Okay, let me just to show that the identity crisis, it's complex. I sort of put it as being, counter to China or not, being bold on the international scene, aligning more with the US and non-aligned rather than being non-aligned. But I just want to show you a photo here. This is a photo of a group of countries called the BRICS, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This was a group that came together in about 10 years ago as a counter to the West, demanding greater power sharing on the globe. So this is called the BRICS, and Modi, Mr. Modi is right there as well. But then you have a very different pair, Modi and Biden. And one of the biggest transformations in Indian foreign policy has been the huge closeness to the US that India has made, to the point of joining, it really is in some sense its most important strategic partner right now. And even 20 years ago, one would never have said that because of India's non-alignment and its post-colonial Nehruvian outlook internationally. Okay, but hold on, because look what you've got here. You have Mr. Modi, this is not that long ago, very fervent conversations, a kind of a bro a picture here with Putin. So what is going on here? So one of the things that I want to point out to you is that one of the drivers of India's post-colonial identity was something called strategic autonomy. And that is, it wanted to preserve its independence and decision-making on the global stage. it has been an obsession of India. It was an obsession of Nehru's. It has come down, right down to today, where India, again, it's a sense of itself. It doesn't want to be a junior partner to the United States, to China, to Russia, whoever. It does not want to be in a junior position. And so, and that was part of the whole non-aligned outlook as well. But so that was during the Cold War, the strategic autonomy, that was the height of that. But after the Cold War ended, when the US, when India was much more tilting toward the Russians, because the Russians were anti-US, helped India more, didn't provide a technology, provided help with its nuclear weapons, which the US had been sanctioning India on. So there is a reason why India was closer to Russia. But once the USSR collapsed, India suddenly didn't have any real friends because it had been non-aligned and the world had changed. And India then, with great reluctance, changed as well. And it shifted to it didn't shift completely into the Western camp. It adopted something that is what we would call multi-alignment. It had relationships with every major country. But it did go into a situation where it was much more trying to cultivate relations with big powers, not the global South, smaller countries that it used to be the champion of, because that's now a new constellation in the post-Cold War period. But in more recent years, in about last 10 years or 10 to 12 years, another shift has taken place. The shift is that from cultivating equal kind of relationships with, say, Russia, China, US, France, Brazil, the big powers, India now is shifting more and more toward cultivating a relationship with United States as its number one partner. The others are important, but the US is the most important. That's a huge change. But because of its history, because of its preference with the strategic autonomy, because it has a historical ties with other major countries like Russia, and in the past with China as well, because as an Asian power, they had relations going way back, and again, anti-West history. But as the China-India relations suffered, this new alignment is in play, which is the US. And I don't want to do too much on this, this is a very, it's an example I wanted to raise. There's something called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue that was formed in the mid-2000s, which is a grouping of US, India, Japan, Australia. And the common thread here is 4 Asian democracies. But it has grown in time. It started off as a way to, after the tsunami in 2004, when they needed relief operations, and India was turned out to be a pretty important player in that. And these 4 countries came together to do that. However, since 2017, and with the Trump administration in particular, that decided that no point in engaging with China, it had failed, and so you had to compete with China. Well, it just so happened that at the same time, India has been going through a very nasty patch with China. From about 2014-15 onwards, they have had a number of showdowns, and let me say where it happened. It happened along the Himalayan border, because one of the things that has been a big sticking point with China and India, they share a mountainous border of 2,000 miles, and most of it is unmarked. And there are many areas where there's competing claims, and in the past, they kept it on the back burner, but since 2017, they've actually had border clashes that have not just been at the level of just, disagreements, but now, and in 2020, the worst of it happened, which was on the, in a particular place, steep in the Ladakh area, way up in the northwest of India, where there were casualties for the first time since 1975. This has created a huge strategic anxiety in India because China is 5 times India's, has got it 5 times India's military. It's far superior to India in economics. And so what does India need? India needs partners now. And there's a huge distrust of China. I've never seen such amount of anti-China sentiment in India that I have had in the, ever really in recent times. And in fact, by the way, India is one of the first to have banned TikTok, which came as a huge, I mean, the Indian young people were up in arms on that, but then because it came on the heels of the 2020 clash where 20 Indians soldiers died, and by the way, many of them, I think, it was it was a combination of different things. It wasn't actually shelling that killed them, but it became a cause célèbre in India, and I think this is it's basically has been a turning point. So I think now the real I'm going to end with this one. This question is how to counter China in the Indo-Pacific area, and it comes down to really a U.S. preference, which is to use a network of its partners and allies, but with the military edge, so that if there is a showdown or there is pressure, then the United States would like India and others to, for example, allow refueling, allow repairing, and maybe even patrolling and joining in military activities. Now, this is something that India, because of its past and because of its continuing sort of autonomy preference, doesn't want to do that. And so there is a bit of an issue on that. How much is India going to really contribute if there is a conflict? Or my other question is, will the US and other allies maybe socialize to India's identity preferences, which would be competing in diplomatic areas, non-military areas, and kind of put pressure in the economic and technology areas? So I'm going to stop with that because I have reached my time, and I'm happy to talk about other things during the Q&A. So let me just stop sharing the. Thank you.
Stop you. Thank you. Since you were talking about military and China, how strong is the military in India?
A good question. Yeah. India has a extremely good military right now because over the last 10, 15 years, it has been building it up. It is either the #1 importer of military equipment or #2 on the world for over the last 5 to 6 years. That means that they're, building up. However, if you look at their domestic capacity, it's not very good. One of the things about autonomy was self-reliance. So something that under Nehru, India tried to do was to build up a defense industry. And along with that, you need a lot of technical pool of engineers and people. And so India does have that. It went for those kind of big tech investments, and it has that, but it has not been very innovative in its technology in the defense. And so it's each thing has, a tank in 10 years, for example, to build a tank, light aircraft, helicopter, again, long time. But it has 2 aircraft carriers, which is a big deal when you're a maritime power. But when you compare it to China, China has 5 times its defense, it spends as 5 times on its defense. India is in no way ready to take China on, which is one of the reasons it doesn't want to push the military edge too much. However, India has nuclear weapons, and which has a deterrence value, meaning it can reach Beijing, it can reach, it used to be only able to reach the western part of China, but now it can reach up to Beijing and beyond. So that is that gives India a lot more, I don't want to use the word confidence, but it feels that it has a certain shield. At the same time, it's not going to help India in the mountainous areas. You can't fight, there you actually have to have a very sophisticated mountain terrain, all weather fighting capability. India does not have that. And it has a long way to go, and it needs American and other help. But there is a question, is the US going to come to India's aid if something happens on those, far off mountainous regions in Himalayas? I doubt it.
What about manufacturing munitions?
Again, the Indians have been behind in that. I mean, they have certain ordnance factories and so forth, but they have those sorts of, lower tech kind of things. But in terms of fighter jets, for example, that has been something that India has struggled to produce. It needs the technology. And one of the reasons that India is so close to Russia is because the Russians, for the last several decades, have been India's single biggest supplier of sophisticated aircraft, of the as well as the aircraft carriers and so forth. So Russia has been much more open sharing technology and advanced weapons. So it's MiG fighters, it's Sukhoi fighters. India has all of that. They couldn't get it, and it's cheaper. So hence, 60% of India's defense supplies, 60% of its imports come from Russia. So you can see why, there was that little tete-a-tete going on between Modi and Putin. They're probably whispering about the next purchase.
What about India imports oil from Russia?
Yes.
Connect that, your comments on that, with climate issues and how India is managing their perspective on that and how they're managing it.
Okay, the climate, okay, so India is not going to be able to give up its fossil fuel very easily, because it's in the middle of a huge economic transformation, and it is at the level of other countries were 50 years ago. So there is a feeling that they're going to try to do the renewables, and so solar and wind. India is the head of a solar alliance, global solar alliance, but they're saying that they can't give up anything. They have to do it all. They're going to have to do the oil and coal, and but at the same time, they're going to build the other renewables up. Russian oil, right now, Russian oil is cheaper. They're getting it at a discount because other countries have been unwilling to buy it. And this is where, again, in fact, the Indians have stepped up their purchase of oil because it's being given to them at a discount. Now, India did not go along with the sanctions that the US put on Russia. And given what I just said about their relationship in the past, you can see why India was not going to do that. But then India is diversifying away from Russia because Russia is going to be in trouble for its own production of military equipment. So the writing is on the wall, and that's going to change. But I do see some questions on the chat as well as here. Tyler, should I call on the,
Oh,
how do you
sure.
want to do this, June?
Yeah,
Or
I have a question. Deepa, as you know very well, Narendra Modi has been widely criticized for being a Hindu supremacist.
Yeah.
I think one cannot deny that, and one does wonder what the 220 million Muslims in India are thinking in terms of these recent regulations which he's put into effect, which basically make it much more difficult for Muslims to come back to India, having been have left the country and now trying to come back. In general, obviously, he has a record of being anti-Muslim in the Gujarat incidents back in 2005, where he basically, it would seem, condoned the riots, which were, very fatal to a few thousand Muslims. So I know you probably have thoughts on that, and there's been a lot of global criticism about that illiberal, aspect of his character.
Right, right. Thank you, Tyler. So the issues that raising, some of you may have read in the newspapers, certainly there's a huge centralization of power in the center and a much more, trying to suppress some of the opposition along the way. Now, as far as the way in which it's going to, to what extent the Muslim impact on Muslims. Let me just say one thing. You're referring specifically to the Citizenship Amendment Act, which
Yes.
is right. What it is something that is given to fast track refugees from certain countries in the neighborhood to India. These are people who have never been citizens in India. These are people who have never come to India. These are people who, because of the partition and other reasons, have been left in these countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan or Afghanistan. And the criticism is that he has basically, what about Muslims some of the Shiites or the Ahmadiyas in Pakistan? If they and the idea is that if they're persecuted minorities in those countries, but the persecuted minorities are Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis. So what the law says is that if you're one of those persecuted minorities in those other countries, that they will fast track your citizenship to come to India, not back to India because they were never there, but come to India. Now certainly it's seen as an anti-Muslim measure because he left Muslims out. But it just so happens that all these minorities are in Muslim majority countries. You see, so it's a complicated calculus, the way they have done it. And the question is, okay, so you're allowing persecuted Hindus in Pakistan to come back, but what about, as I said, persecuted other Muslims who want to come? And this is where the nationalist Hindutva project comes in from Mr. Modi, who sees it as a way of building up the Hindu nationalist project in India. And it is something that, has come under a lot of criticism within India. There were protests, and it's still not law yet, in the sense that many people have not states have not put it into law and so forth. So it's still under challenge. And there are a lot of laws that people pass in India. Let me say one thing. It never gets implemented. Many things like, things like the cow protection law has been in the Indian law books since 1950s. No one used to care anything about it. And so suddenly, when you have a certain government in power, they can always go back and say, oh, we actually have a law here that everybody has been neglecting. But you're right. I mean, it's certainly the democratic backsliding is something that is on many people's minds. I think the difference is that the opposition has been extraordinarily they've been disastrous in mounting a challenge. They could, and because of a variety of reasons, they haven't. And so, and I want to end with one thing. The number, when you think about, the Hindutva project, let me just say that out of the voting from 2014 and 2019, the last two elections when the BJP came to power, the votes actually across the country, the vote share for the 2014 elections for the BJP was 39%. The vote share for the BJP in 2019 was 41%. That is not a majority. Because of the British first past the post voting system that was set up, given to India in the parliamentary system, whoever gets a plurality in these districts wins it all. And therefore, the current government has a huge majority in parliament, even though it doesn't have, a proportional, it's not a proportional system. So
Mhm.
you have to understand and you have to break down the South versus the North and so on. So Gujarat is a specific case where it was Mr. Modi's home and stronghold. So one has to differentiate. This is the problem with India. I think one can talk about a country like China and really make some sweeping comments and it'll be true. It's very difficult. My students have a big problem. They say, Professor, it's so much easier to understand China than India. I said, yeah, you need to visit India. You need to come there, kind of get a sense. Otherwise, you're never going to understand it, really.
Right. Another quick question, if I could, about China, the relationship with China. Well, it makes one wonder why the Chinese back 2 years ago would have incited these Himalaya border incidents when in fact there was very little to gain for the Chinese other than a few, 100 square yards of territory at the expense of turning off India and making India very, very negative about relations with the Chinese. So have you thought about that? Why would the Chinese bother to incite those incidents when in fact the net result was they made an enemy out of China, out of India? What am I missing here?
Tyler, you're asking an excellent question. In fact, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article and I ended with that, saying that this is going to go down in Chinese foreign as an epic failure in Chinese foreign policy when they look back on this period, because India had been, kind of balancing relations with all these different countries. And Modi had come into power saying that he wanted to have greater economic ties with China because it made sense for India at that time. However, my sense is that China, two things. One, China underestimated India. China has been, I think, seeing itself as a peer competitor to the United States. It looks at India and it sees India as a much weaker power, not to be taken very seriously, because India had never done anything too bold, and as I said, was a kind of more defensive power, and so it didn't place that much value on India's response. It kind of thought that it would do what it did in the past, kind of play it down and try to save face on both sides, and they just didn't talk about it. But then China would have moved in and gotten a little bit more Salami's tactics, where you gain a few square meters, but you keep going like that. So that's one. Secondly, and this is where the identity question comes in, Tyler. I think Mr. Xi Jinping and Beijing thought that India is going to be so obsessed with the strategic autonomy, it is still never going to throw its weight in closer to the United States. That somehow you can just bet that the Indians are still going to go back to their non-alignment. The BRICS still want to maintain a close ties with the Chinese and the Russians, and have that kind of a outlook that they would be so hell-bent on the identity that they would maybe sacrifice a little bit of the security. So it's both identity and both a failure of Chinese underestimation.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Peter,
Yes, listening to your comments, which have been great, it reminds me of 20 years or more ago, Samuel Huntington wrote this, The Clash of Civilizations, Remake the World Order. And
Yep.
he brought out these themes of balancing and civilization and identity. And I wanted to ask if you think that that framework has still works, or if there were some shortcomings in it. And secondly, one of the themes was the notion of regionalization, that you would see a major emerging power like India have a very impactful policy in its neighborhood. And for India, we think of Pakistan, Iran, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So how do you see that evolving for India?
Okay. Let me start with the question about regionalism, because the clash of civilizations is a huge thing, and I actually haven't thought about it in a very long time. But you do raise a question when I see in the chat box, somebody says, I didn't hear you say Pakistan even once in your talk. And you know what, that is actually kind of, you're right, I didn't. And it wasn't exactly a slip of the mind, but when I'm talking about the bigger pictures, it actually doesn't figure in very much. But regionalization, yes. One of the things that Modi and even Singh, who was there before him, did believe was that in order for India to be a great power on the global stage, you have to sort out your own neighborhood. Okay, how can you, if you're not a major player in your own neighborhood, what kind of credibility are you going to have on the global scene? So in 2014 and before, they did start a good kind of, neighborhood policy, which was basically to say that India would perhaps play a big role as a public goods provider. If there was distress in the banking system or something, that India would step in. If there was a natural disaster, India would supply the fresh water, ship it there, and so forth. So it was becoming much more, there was a lot more aid being given, and that is still there. But the neighbors now, India has come to this realization a little too late, because there's another power ready and willing to provide the same things, China. The rise of China, this is my book actually that I'm focusing on the Indian Ocean and the competition. The rise of China in South Asia is really something that is phenomenal right now. it has managed to knock India out as number one in many of these countries. Bangladesh, Pakistan, of course, has been a separate story, but Sri Lanka, Maldives, Nepal, these were all, India took them for granted. And now there's an actual competition. So India is going to have to work harder for this kind of regional influence. And whether it's going to do it, it's still up in the air. But let me say that as China has been more and more involved for the last 10 years, it is finding that it is having pushback in these countries because there is charges of corruption, non-transparency, building huge white elephants. I was just in Sri Lanka. There is an entire area called the Port City that has been reclaimed land, and it's going to look like Dubai or something once the Chinese are done with that. It's huge. It's going to be a banking, financial sector, and so forth. However, there's a lot of pushback by the local population saying that, you know, they had just had an economic crisis. Where is all this money going into this kind of project? So I think, I think it's going to be, you know, nothing, you can't take it for granted. You don't know what the outcome is, but I do think when you look at that geography, if I put that map back up, you'll see that for China, it's a long way to the Indian Ocean. India is a behemoth there, and all these countries have what I would call an India first policy still, because they know that India can make life kind of hard for them if they don't. And Pakistan, one thing I'm just going to say, reason I didn't mention anything is because Pakistan's domestic turmoils, they have tied themselves up in a knot, frankly. And just when you think, you know, 8 years ago, it looked like maybe things were changing with Imran Khan coming in and having turning over a new leaf, more democratic, pushing the military to the side. Well, you have the exact opposite happening now, where, you know, the democracy has suffered a huge blow in total public, you know, view when they threw out Imran Khan. He's in jail right now, the former president, prime minister, and the population have not been able to mount a comeback. The military is back in power. China is very involved in Pakistan, has been since the 1960s. So what you see in Pakistan is alliance between China and Pakistan as a way of countering the Indians. So this has been something that's historical. So, but because Pakistan really is both economically right now, it's been almost, you know, it is at the IMF knocking at the doors, asking for a bailout, asking for China. Even the Chinese are getting a little tired of the number of bailouts. And finally, you're seeing many more attacks now against foreign companies and Chinese. And just this morning, there was some attack against a Japanese group in Karachi. So things are really, you know, sort of spiraling out of control there. And, you know, India is really not paying that much attention because they don't need to right now. It's not a good thing because you don't want an out of control neighbor on your border.
So a question
Yeah.
on, I guess, the labor force and the young people. I think there was very recently an article in the Wall Street Journal, or an opinion, talking about the fact that you do have many college students, but they're not being able to be employed. And that for the future, if India wants to succeed as an economic powerhouse, they're not training people in the right way.
Yes. You know what? One of the main things about India's promise in terms of its economic growth was going to be this big demographic dividend. Working age group is the largest in India, in the world right now, in terms of people, young people. But we're in the midst of that, and India has to grab the opportunity right now. And I've heard when the current government came into power, they said they were going to create 10 million jobs every year. They have not been able to do that. I'm sorry, every month, because it was some astronomical number of figures that you needed to get in order to employ these people. Now, where do you employ them? Well, let's look at manufacturing. Manufacturing is something where you employ a lot of people, unlike, say, software engineers, because software, even though it makes up a large portion of the GDP, it's not a very labor intensive to the same extent as manufacturing. Manufacturing has, as a share of India's GDP, has been stuck at 15 to 16% for 20 years. And the current government said that they would, by 2025, they would get it up to 25%. They have not managed to do that. If there is going to be a dent in the electoral success of Mr. Modi, it will come because of that. The fact that the unemployment among young people is very high. And now, India is a big powerhouse in services. We all know that. And but will that deliver the promise of jobs? This is a big debate in India. I was just at a conference at GW last week where the former Reserve Bank governor of India was speaking, and I was chairing it. And he, of course, had a fairly rosy picture of services, ability to produce many more jobs, apparently through some, various multiplier effects, and having a much more, you need a lot, for every service person, you need 5 or 6 supporting people in different areas. Now, I don't think many people bought that argument, so it's not, I'm not an economist, but it didn't sound very persuasive. So the real question is, will India become old before it's rich? And it could. And that would be what you would call the demographic disaster, not the dividend.
Another question, many manufacturers, US companies, are leaving or thinking of leaving China because of the turmoil in that market for them in China, and they're going to smaller Asian countries. Is India going after that sector in China to entreat them to move to India instead?
Very good question. This is something that, especially since the pandemic, where the supply chains have been over-concentrated in China, and also because of the rising competition and tension, both those things are pushing the US and other countries to think about offshoring from China and going other places. Well, that in theory, it's a very good, that's a very good opportunity for India. But many of these companies, the large companies, don't really want to move just like that. It's not going to happen overnight. And even where it is happening, the country that they're going to most is Vietnam. I was just in Vietnam 2 months ago, giving some talks. Of course, I asked a question about that. And one of the things that the Vietnamese said is that, yes, they're absolutely coming, but that the ability of Vietnam to absorb that many companies and so on is not that high. Vietnam is
Yeah.
not China. And so they're able to, it certainly is going to help Vietnam grow. Now, India is one country that it could absorb much more.
Mm.
But because one of the problems with India is its infrastructure. If any of you have visited India, it has, everything from ports to roads to airports. These are all, a lot of stumbling blocks there. But one thing that Modi government has done a pretty remarkable job is infrastructure. The situation has improved dramatically. And I think it's laid the foundation for exactly this, for having more companies, and companies are coming, but not anywhere at the rate that one initially thought it would. And so, it's a glass half empty, I think I would say on that question. But certainly India, because it's moved closer to the US and it is not in good terms with China, India clearly is going to push for this, and friend shoring is something that is a big deal in India now, and it seems like everybody wants to, now the word is de-risk from China. But then at the same time, if you want, so India's pouring a lot of money into trying to set up manufacturing for semiconductors and so on, which would be huge. So they're talking to the Taiwanese company, talking to Apple. I think it's going to happen. It's just not going to happen as fast as we think.
Much has been made. I don't know if it's now gotten better about the red tape of operating a business or getting even a business established in India. So is that also an obstacle to companies coming into India?
It is much less now, but just to give you an example of what the government did, I mean, I think on the economy, the government has been doing quite a lot, actually, because a lot had to be done. But just in terms of taxes, every state has its own taxes. There was no interstate understanding of taxation. So if you're like, a regular a trucker going from one state to the other, at the border, you have to stop, fill out all these forms, and then pay certain taxes before you can take your goods into the neighboring state. It's crazy. So, and can you imagine the kind of red tape that itself? Because suppose you're manufacturing something in one state, but you need to transport it from another state's port. You have to go through all those steps, right? So one of the things Modi did was he simplified it. It's almost like, now it's almost like a universal thing. And that was big protest by the states because they wanted that extra money, but he pushed it through because of it had stalled for tens of years because there was no majority in parliament. He pushed it through. So these are the kind of things that the other side of the ledger where he has made progress. And so, yes, so it is better. But even things like ports, why is it that India, with all its incredible coastline, is not as efficient of a port as its neighbor in Sri Lanka? Why are many more transshipment and so on going to Sri Lanka, and their ports are more effective? Well, apart from the pure infrastructure, it's regulations. India, it takes days to clear your goods from coming in with your cargo into the harbor. You're losing time and money that way. Whereas in Sri Lanka, it's a free port. You go in, Singapore, free port. You don't have this kind of bottlenecks. So these are the kind of things that have to be changed if you're going to be competitive. You have to become more efficient.
And that's sheer bureaucracy as opposed to security?
Sorry?
That is sheer bureaucracy, not security issues?
Well, you can make any issue into a security issue. And so, non-trade barriers, for example, often say health issues you have to look at, but it's really economic, or in India's case, bureaucratic. I think they can certainly speed things up. But yes, India does have a little bit more security, but then what they have to do is have better security, not more bureaucracy to handle that, right? Tyler?
Deepa, I have
Yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, I just,
Okay, no, a question about gender equivalence in India. I read where only 28%, roughly plus or minus, of Indian women are actually in the workforce, and that compares shockingly to double that number in China.
Mhm.
And so that, refers back to, I guess, a general feeling that women are simply not made to enter the workforce in any kind of serious way. Can you comment on how much progress is going on in that regard to enhance workforce participation?
Yeah, I think the one thing you have to start off with again is to differentiate now in the different parts of India. So the South and West, you find a different story in terms of women's participation, in terms of women's empowerment. If you go north and somewhat east, you find a different picture. But especially in the big states like UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, the ones that are in the mid and north and northwest, they are really stuck in the past. In many ways, unfortunately, they have a large population, much larger than the South states. So the one state, UP, its population is over 200 million, which is comparable. I mean, and you compare that to Kerala, which is one of the most progressive states and the best in terms of health, education, gender parity, and so on, 40 million. So, the the numbers get skewed because they are concentrated in certain areas. That said, when you put all the population together, there is a problem. This is, something that if you look at the media, if you look at Bollywood, there's a huge push for gender equality. When I watch Bollywood, all the Netflix series and so on, I mean, just to give a kind of anecdotal thing, this is not something that people don't know about or that people don't care about. But a lot of this is also still in the rural areas that this is an issue. And, 70% of people still live in the rural areas, so it is a problem.
Is that
But,
religion?
sorry?
Is that also religion?
I wouldn't say it's religious, it's social. The idea that women, I mean, just like here 100 years ago, you don't really want a woman to be out in the public working for not really religious reasons, but for social reasons. But I think that is, the ethos is changing. But the government is going to have to do a lot more about it in terms of putting more money into education and making things safe for women to even go to work. There's that element also. For instance, in the software industry, a lot of women in the cities have to work as back office people, outsourced and you have to work hours that are US hours, which means you've got to be at the office during night. And that used to be a big problem for young women, as opposed to young men. So there are problems at multiple levels. And I think that the preference given to boys, I mean, there's many layers of this problem, but I think you can start at least by things that are kind of tangible before you hit the social. Though, as I said, just from the media and the general, the entertainment industry, there is a change.
Good.
Yeah.
Like every movie has some kind of a feminist critique built into it.
Yes.
And a related question, I think, I gather the caste system is gradually fading from the scene. It's less of a social denominator kind of, or definition as to what social class you were born into. Am I right about that?
You're partially right. I think something that has been ingrained for 2,500 years, it is not going to change unfortunately, it's taken much longer, but the change is quickening. Let me put it that way. The change is quickening, and that is partly because the economic opportunities are now trickling down to the lower caste. So they are able to kind of buy themselves out of their caste situation. And you see that happening quite a lot. So 2 generations ago, someone who was, kept down because of their caste, their grandchildren are in universities marrying people from a different caste, doing jobs that they would not have been ordinary to see themselves in, and so
Yeah.
forth. So it's fighting the caste system is something, again, that is becoming socially a cause that many people just buy into now.
Of course, Modi himself is a lower caste individual, right?
He is, and he certainly uses that as one way of mobilizing the broader Hindu population, which used to be a little bit more divided along caste and politics. And there's still quite a bit of that, but that's one of the things that he's trying to break. But he's partly doing it for political reasons so that you can actually then get a broader group where where your identification label, the marker, is Hindu, not by which caste you are.
Thank you so much, Deepa. We were running out of time, and I know all of us have a lot more questions to ask you, so you'll have to come back. Maybe after the election and things have settled down again, we can see what happened. But, this was wonderful. We certainly enjoyed this. India is a beautiful country. And as you said, varied from, all different regions and cities, and just an amazing place to visit. So please join us in 2 weeks, Monday, May 6th, and we will be turning to Brazil. And the questions that we have for Brazil, what is its role in Latin America? What are its economic and political challenge? What is its relationship? These sound sort of familiar. We ask them all the time with US, Russia, China, and BRICS. So we will see you in 2 weeks. Deepa, again, this was wonderful. Thank you very much. You're a great spokesman. I think we're all fascinated and interested in going to India now. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for the
Deepa.
invitation. I enjoyed
you.
it. Bye-bye.